Smart materials allow you to texture your objects with relative ease. It uses conditions about your objects like the convexity or the ambient occlusion or the direction it's facing in order to apply your textures, as opposed to you having to paint them all manually. So in the paint room, you should have access to a window called Smart Materials, and in there you will see there's a lot of smart materials that are provided with 3D-Coat. And they're organized into these different categories. You've got cartoony ones, you've got plastic ones. The rock is a folder that I made myself. But you've also got wood, or you have different metals. And you can see how these all look. Now, in order for smart materials to work, you need to have two special textures. You need an ambient occlusion layer, and you need a curvature layer. Now, I already have some here. Just for testing purposes, I'm going to delete those. Now you may be thinking that we already baked some ambient occlusion when we baked our normal map. This is not quite what the smart materials need. There's a special option here if you go up to Textures, Calculate Occlusion, and just hit OK. This is the type of ambient occlusion map it needs. This process usually takes a few seconds. It's dependent on your texture resolution, but this is a fairly low res texture. So it calculates pretty quickly. So that's one, and you'll get an ambient occlusion layer out of that. Then we need to go to Textures and Calculate Curvature. And this will calculate basically the convexity of the object. Alright, now it may seem like nothing happened, but we got a curvature map. And if I turn that on, this is what it looks like. So areas where it's convex are painted white, and areas where it's concave are painted black. So how do we use smart materials? Well, we need a layer to put them on. So I'm going to go down here, I'm just going to make a new layer. I'm just going to call this one Base. What I'm going to do is I already know that this one will show up really well, so I go to Cartoon, and I'll pick this wooden looking one. And what will happen is you'll get a little preview here. And when you're using this preview, you can actually change aspects about the texture using these options up here. For example, we can rotate it. We can move it around. We can scale the texture. Or we can stretch it. I like to avoid using that one if possible. But most of these defaults seem like they will work very nicely. So then I can just go in with my paintbrush and start painting the texture where I need it. But in this case, I could instead just go to my fill tool and fill the entire layer. This may take a few seconds. Alright. And as you see, we've got a wooden rock. Now, smart materials don't have to cover the entire object. They could only cover part of it, so I'm going to make a new layer. I'm going to call it Paint. And I'm going to go to the Leaks section right here, and I'll pick this first one. And what this does is this will apply a dripping paint sort of texture to only the top of my object. So I'll go ahead and I'll fill this layer. And you see I get paint on just the top of it. So how do these smart materials work? Well, let me delete this layer. Let's take a look at that cartoon wood. So if I right click on it, I can go to the Smart Material Editor. And you'll see this object or this material consists of 3 different layers. I'll go by them one by one. So the first layer is just the base wood texture you can see there. It's applied always, which is what this icon right here, always, that's the condition mask. And it's just applied onto the object from all directions. Nothing too terribly special about that. Now the next layer, it's a much lighter brown color, but the important thing to note here is the condition mask, and it is set to more on convex. So as you see, it's only being applied to convex surfaces. If I decrease the degree here, then you see I can change how much it is applied. And then the next layer is an ambient occlusion layer, which is set by here. It's more in shadow. And that means that that's based on the ambient occlusion layer. If I decrease the degree, you'll see it's only applied in areas where the ambient occlusion is strong. Right? Let me just cancel that. And if I go to the leaks material, this one just consists of one layer, but you see that its degree, its condition mask, is set to more on top. So as you see, I could fill in considerably more. But then we also have something here called edge scattering, which is basically if I turn that off, you see that the cutoff here is fairly flat. Fortunately, I cannot undo deleting that, but if I were to click here and just pick some texture, like this one for instance, then you'll see that we get the paint pushed past the edge that there would have been if we didn't have any condition at all. We can increase the edge scattering, and that's how this material works. All right. So let's make our own smart material real quick here. Not one that would be practical per se, but just one that will demonstrate to you how all these different condition masks work. So I'm going to get rid of my base. I'm going to get rid of this layer 9. Right, I'm just going to make a new layer. I'm going to go to custom. I'm just going to hit new to make my own. And you'll see we get a default just white material. So we can change the color. I'm going to leave it at white for now. And we can load in a texture. So I'm going to go to my personal texture library. And I'm just going to load in. Let me load in one of these metal ones, specifically one of these. There we go. Again, I said this isn't going to be practical, but it will demonstrate the effects. So what this color will do is it will actually tint the texture that you put in. So we could tint this yellow, for instance. Now, something else we can do with the textures is if we click this little arrow, we get some options about them. We can change the scaling, and we can also use this curve to change the brightness. So if you've ever worked with something like curves in Photoshop, this functions exactly the same way. So this is if we want to make minor adjustments to the levels of our texture without having to save out a whole new image file. We can also invert it, and we can apply procedural noise, which is pretty interesting. So if you need something that will break it up, then we can apply just that. Now I'm not going to in this case. I'm just going to leave it as is. Hit done. All right. Now the next option down here is depth. So if we want to have a depth texture to this that will affect the normal map, we can apply one here. This uses a black and white map. So if I click there, I'm going to go to my texture library. I'm going to pick one of my grunge maps, and I'll just pick this one. And you'll see we get a lot of noisy surface we get some noisy surface details. So I can decrease how intense those details are using this slider right here. You typically want to leave this as pretty weak, so I'm just going to go with maybe 10%. There we go. Now you can also change the roughness of this. So if I make the roughness 0, you see it's very, very shiny, but we can set a texture to control that. So if I go to my texture libraries, to my noise, and I'll just pick this one because it's very high contrast, then you'll see we get some areas that are really shiny and some areas that are really dull. If I change the scale, hopefully you'll see that a little bit more clearly. There we go. So you can see, like, right there, that area is very dull, whereas the area immediately next to it, very bright. We can also load in metalness textures. So if I load in another noise, like this one, and I need to increase the value of that to 100% for basically the multiplication factor. So it's being multiplied by 100%. So if it's 0%, this texture will not show up at all. So you typically want to leave these at 100%. I could decrease the roughness a bit, maybe. Or sorry, I would want that to stay high. I could go into the actual texture and I can make it a little bit brighter to increase my roughness. But it's coming across very clearly with the metalness texture, where you can see certain areas are made out of metal and certain areas are not. So if I went here and if I inverted this, then you'll see it's mostly metal. But I'm going to leave that as the way it was. Okay, now that we have that, I can add on a new layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this at a color of, let's leave it sort of gray. I'm going to increase my roughness a little bit, keep my metalness at 100, and for the degree, I'm going to make it more on convex. Now, it may look a little strange, and that's because we have depth set to 100%. If I set the depth to 0, then you see it looks a lot flatter. Let me turn this off just so hopefully you'll see that a little bit better. So you can see the difference, right? I'm going to make this a little less obnoxious just so you can see it a bit better. Alright, now with this I can increase the degree and you can see more of it's going to be applied there, but you see how it's fairly uniform as it goes across these convex surfaces? I don't like that. So I can add on a condition mask texture, which will basically modulate that value so it isn't so uniform. So I'll go back to my grunge textures and I'll load up, say, an image like that. Now it may be a little hard to see, so let me increase the contrast of this a bit. There we go. But now you can see that even though as I increase the degree, there are some areas it's a lot more choppy now. Now in addition to that, you also have something called edge scattering. So this actually does nothing unless you put a texture in there. So I'll put in another texture. And what this does is this will push your layer past the borders of where it would have ended up if you had just used the condition mask. And the brighter this is, the more it will scatter the edges inward, and if it's darker, it will actually push them away from the condition mask, which in this case would be a convex surface. It may be a little confusing. It's one of those things where you have to sort of play around with it in order to really get a hang for it. So I'm just going to get rid of that now. I don't really want it that much. And then you can also change the contrast for how the layer is applied. So in this case, if I actually lower the contrast a bit to a negative value, then you see these this condition mask texture I used isn't quite so sharp. So now I can add a new layer if I want. I'm just going to make this one say like bright red, no metalness, and fairly high roughness. What I can do with this one is I can apply it, let's say, more on flat surfaces, which will apply it anywhere where it's not convex or concave. Actually, that's kind of blocking out my first layer. So instead, I'm just going to put this, say, more on top, like that one. There we go. Yeah, it can be a little overpowering. So let me add a condition mask texture. Let's give this one like a dirt kind of look to it. Now you see the depth is coming across really strongly here, so I'm going to reduce that depth to say something like 2%. But you can see now that's only getting applied on the top. I can also add on some edge scattering in the form of, say, a noise. So I'll try and make that a little bit brighter. And now we have our smart material. Not sure how good it's going to be, but though that is the process you will typically go through in order to make one. So now that we have it, we can give it a name. So I'll call this demo, and we can save it, and it will be loaded into whatever folder you created in it. So once we have it selected, I can fill the entire layer with it, and we'll see what we get. Very interesting. So you can see now if we go to our texture editor, we get quite a dramatic color map. Some roughness and a metalness. And as I mentioned earlier, you see the metalness map is very high contrast. It's pretty much either entirely black or entirely white. Very few gray values, unlike what you get with the roughness map. If we go back to the color, and we are pretty much set with that. So those are smart materials. They can make your texturing workflow very quick for certain features. In the next video, I will talk about how to export all of these different layers and the object itself for use in other programs, and how to import objects if you just want to do texture painting, as opposed to having to sculpt them from scratch inside of 3D-Coat.